Well, thank you very much, and it's a great pleasure to be back here again. I think I've been here every year in my period of office. I think people will have mixed feelings about my own role or government in general, but I think one of the things we have contributed, and I've contributed, is continuity and creating a longer-term perspective. I think one of our really big achievements in government has been creating an industrial strategy which goes beyond the political cycle. And I like to think that some of that thinking has permeated into further and higher education. But let me just, instead of looking back, let me look forward about what some of the threats and opportunities are. I think in terms of opportunities, I think there will be growing demand for what you do. I sometimes describe the role of FE colleges as having a dual mandate. But actually, you have multiple roles, but two in particular, I think one of which there is rapidly growing and powerful demand is high-level skills, and I'll talk more about that later. But contrasting, there is a lot of the remedial work that many of you have to do with skill level 1, 2, teenagers who, frankly, haven't done well in the school system, and you're having to pick up the pieces. But, I mean, those are two key roles, but there are others. Some of you run Orthodox sixth forms. Some of you run adult community colleges as well. So there's a sort of multiple role. I think it's very clear to me that the demand for those things is continuing and growing, and we have to meet it somehow. I think the second problem, and this is a worry, and it lurks constantly at the back of my mind, and I'm sure yours, is money. We are still in a financially constrained environment. We're just over halfway through the process of eliminating what we call the structural deficit on the budget that was the legacy of the banking crisis. It's still there. And whoever is in the government next, any party, any combination of parties, is going to be grappling with this issue. Money will be scarce. And politicians who've been to your conference may pretend otherwise. I'm not going to pretend otherwise. It's not going to be easy, right? Now, there are varying ways of dealing with it. Under this government, predominantly the burden of deficit reduction has fallen on public spending. It's been difficult. It could have been actually in your sector a great deal worse. I think I've told you this at previous conferences. When I first stepped through the door, I had a menu put in front of me, and FE had minus 40% against it. And we didn't allow that to happen, but equally it's not been good. The problem is this continues. And the existing pattern is something of the order of 20% of the burden falling on tax, 80% on public spending. I personally don't think that's sustainable. I've been making the case for higher tax relative to public spending. That is not a fashionable view. It's not a popular view, but I will continue to make it. But if the burden continues to fall overwhelmingly on public spending, then it will get difficult, and it will get difficult for bits of public spending that are unprotected. And I think you're all very well aware that you have an unprotected status within an unprotected department, which is mine, and you have an unprotected status within a protected department, which is the Department of Education. I don't know what my successors and the DFE successors will do, but those are the pressures that we're under. Within that, there are clearly preferences to be given. I've seen some of your expectations for the future, some of the ideas circulating, how we can do more generous things for students. Well, of course, student support comes at the expense of funding of colleges themselves. So there are some very, very painful choices out there, and it isn't going to get easier. That doesn't mean to say it's hopeless. Many of you have done incredibly innovative things in a difficult financial environment, and I expect that will continue. There are sources of growth. Apprenticeship funding has been one. Higher education in FE has been another. Many of you have turned to the private sector for contractual work. Some of you operate overseas. And there are these and other opportunities. There will be continuing pressures on the cost base. That's true throughout the public sector. I mean, not that you're strictly the public sector, but throughout publicly funded bodies. And some of this, and unfortunately, is going to result in pressure on services, but hopefully you will find innovative ways of teaching, different forms of administration which ease some of the pressures. So I think those two, looking forward, those are the two big themes. There will be an increasing demand for what you do. There will be constant, relentless, I'm afraid, pressure on government funding, and nothing I say will change that. I think the third irreversible trend is localization. I was sitting at the back listening to your previous discussion from the Local Enterprise Partnership, and I think, whether or not you like it and whether or not I like it, there is growing pressure now to decentralize funding. Britain is a very highly centralized country. We've often said that, but done nothing about it. There are now very strong pressures to do something about it. The Scottish referendum was a bit of a game changer here, and I think in the wake of it, we're not just going to get more devolution to Scotland, but to within England in ways that aren't yet totally clear. But you've had a forewarning of this in the form of the growth deals, which, as you know, have incorporated FE capital, albeit ring-fenced. There are currently more adventurous arrangements with Manchester and are currently under negotiation with Leeds and Sheffield and other places, which will mean that significant parts of the budgets that you feed into will be devolved. And that may be good in some areas. It's often best to be close to the customers, and I often sense that local enterprise partnerships have a better feel for the role of colleges than central Whitehall departments. But you may be out of luck. You may get a bad LEP. But whether good or bad, decentralization is very much a coming theme, and I think you're going to have to adapt to it. Now, having said all that, I try to go out on regional visits once a week. I frequently visit many of your colleges. I often go with a certain amount of trepidation, knowing that you're under financial pressure and expecting to get an earful. But actually, when I do go, I find some really inspirational, very innovative things happening, which I take away and just wonder how we can bottle all this stuff and do more of it. There are just a few examples that stuck in my mind. I was at Hull, that's about a year ago, I think, in their construction department. It's one of their biggest construction skills operations in an FE college, and they've managed to link it up with big restoration work in social housing or areas of deprived housing, so that the youngsters are not just getting training, they're also directly contributing to something of social value. There were two colleges. One I opened a section in Fareham, I think, another at Dudley, where advanced engineering skills were being developed in partnership with local companies and leading engineering companies who were part funding it, and several others of that kind. And Central Bedfordshire, I recall, a business incubation centre, small companies being developed on the campus, which meant that the students not only learnt directly, but they had an opportunity to do work experience with companies on the site who were growing. And I'm sure that there are stories like that I could multiply many times over. But let me just go back to some of the themes I started with about some of the emerging trends, and I think where government, or certainly my bit of government, is heading. I think one of them is the growing importance of higher level skills. And this is partly coming through because of the stage of the economy and the stage of the cycle in economic recovery. I think when I first started this job, skills were an issue, and I would go to parts of the country even with high levels of unemployment, and people would tell me they can't expand because they can't get the skills. It's now becoming extremely acute. And in some of the growth industries, like, say, the car industry or offshore oil and gas or wind, they're just crippled by lack of trained people. Similarly, in some of the high-tech IT industries. It's a very, very serious problem. And government and business and providers, people like yourselves, this is a major area of demand and opportunity. We have tried within our financial constraints to fund, certainly over the last year, there's been a big injection of funding into higher apprenticeships. We've developed these trailblazer schemes, which you may have come across, which are basically apprenticeship arrangements where we're trying to raise quality standards to an industry-approved level. And about 40% of these are in higher skills. We've also launched this system of national colleges, which hopefully will work alongside you and may indeed incorporate your colleges in areas like the railway skills going to be required for HS2, nuclear power, coding for the IT sector, tunneling, a whole variety of other high-level skills that we're very deficient at, and creating institutions or building on your institutions where we can provide these things in substantial quantities. So that there is a recognition that this is of enormous importance. And I think one of the specific ways in which your sector is responding to this is HE and FE, growing demand for sort of degree-level courses, both vocational and otherwise. We're trying to promote this agenda because we recognize that there's a demand for it and because we recognize it's popular. You will know that there is a consultation out at the moment for bringing HNCs, HNDs within the FE sector. We're also looking at, for example, the issue about how we treat students in an equitable way between HE and FE. I mean, we can't just pay all FE students as university students. It would cripple the economy, amongst other things. And of course, they're less mobile. But nonetheless, there is an increasing overlap. And it is becoming increasingly invidious that somebody going to an advanced skills college, probably away from home, is paid as an FE student. Whereas if a university student who is operating in their hometown gets all the benefits of student support. And there is something wrong here. And what I want to do is to see this increasingly treated in an equitable and more homogeneous way. But I think in this whole area of HE, in FE, advanced skills, a lot is happening, and we're trying to create institutions and funding mechanisms that make it more straightforward. I think at the other end of the scale, what I would call the other bit of the dual mandate, we do see your colleges producing exceptional good results with English and maths, with people who have failed in the school system. I fear that will continue. We've got the educational reforms and they will produce results, but there is going to be a growing problem with that sector of the population. I think in addition to that, we have the traineeship program, which is growing quite rapidly. These, as you know, are for young people who are not ready to do a proper apprenticeship. They're not ready to go into a skill level 3 course. They need preparatory work, which is partly the basic academic disciplines of English and maths, but also combined with some work experience. And there is a growing opportunities for colleges to operate in that space. And I would also put in that category, though of course it's quite different, is the work in adult and community learning. I think, as I've told you before, when I came into this job, there were people in Whitehall who would like to have got rid of it altogether, at least public funding. I took very strong exception to it. And we have managed to preserve the programme, the government support for the programme, at least in nominal terms. It has been ring-fenced. And that some really, I see some really remarkable things happening. The City Lit, which I know of in London, is something of a model. But there are things in Kirklees College, in the Northern College in Barnsley, and many others, which are absolute role models internationally, let alone nationally. And I think we do need to think through how having preserve that sector, how it can be taken forward in a dynamic way. One of the things I'm looking at the moment is seeing how, for example, we can use the adult community learning programs as a way of helping the large numbers of people who are isolated in the community because they've had problems with mental illness, how we get them back into active learning and work in many cases. As many of you will know, my own experience of adult education was through my mother, who had that experience and was saved really by an adult college. And I see enormous potential for it working with colleagues in the Department of Health. Let me just conclude with a couple of sort of broader thoughts to finish. I think, first of all, some of you will be aware that I spoke at Cambridge, I think about a year ago, trying to set out a long-term vision of the sector and its links more generally with training and with higher education. And I referred back to one of my predecessors, who was a man called Anthony Crosland, who some of you remember from the 1960s, author of The Future of Socialism and other things. And he had a vision about how higher vocational skills were going to develop alongside but interacting with the university sector, filling the gap which used to be filled by polytechnics. And it was never realized. You know, Britain just lost its way in that area. And the whole field of higher vocational skills, which some other countries do extremely well at, and we've historically done very badly at over the last few decades, is, I think, an area we just have to give total focus on. And if you don't do it, nobody will do it. It is the college sectors that has the opportunity to deliver this properly and at very high quality. So that's the first big thought, and if I feel in my 5 years I've helped to at least create the foundations for that, I will feel I'd have done something useful. I think the second point to leave you with is about the politics of all this. I've been very much aware in my job that the FE and adult sector doesn't have an enormous number of friends in the top end of Whitehall and politics. By contrast with universities, anything happens adversely with universities, there are dozens of vice-chancellors in the House of Lords. Students will be out on the streets, as they are in London this afternoon. But FE, adult education, has not had that traction and that punch. And as it happens, you've had ministers, in my case, who are enormously sympathetic to the sector and want to help it within the financial constraints we have. That is not guaranteed. And I think one of the issues you've just got to focus on, and I hope this doesn't sound as if I'm teaching you to suck eggs, but actually is building a base of support for the FE and adult sector, because it cannot be guaranteed, and we are in the face of difficult financial times. So on that slightly sobering note, I'll conclude and let you ask me some questions. Thank you very much.
Prince, do have a seat. Can you take the sofa? We've just got a few minutes to talk to the Secretary of State about that. Why don't I pick up on that very note? You talk about your sympathy with the sector and that sense of building a base of support. Is that a way of saying financially it's really not going to get much easier? So you need friends wherever you can find them?
Yes, that actually was what I'm saying. I mean, financially it isn't going to get easier. That doesn't mean to say that the position is bad. It can be turned around, innovative forms of funding, going for the growth areas, as I mentioned. A lot of colleges are doing extremely well, and some of them will flourish. But the financial environment is going to get more difficult, not less difficult.
You could be in a very different place, a different political environment in 6 months' time. If you were starting from scratch, one of the questions that's come up quite a lot over the last couple of days is the 16 to 18 funding. It's not ring-fenced in the moment in the way that the school's budget is, the early years is. Would that be a priority for you?
Well, my party has said that we want to extend the principle of ring-fencing schools to right the way through to 18. So on a purely party political basis, that's where we've pitched our tent. And David Laws, who was our
Would it be
Minister.
the same sort of ring-fence then
yes,
that we're seeing on
that's
schools?
Right. I have slightly mixed feelings about ring-fencing because my own bit of government doesn't benefit from it. But I think we would all accept that basic education should come before other things. That is, fundamental to a civilized society, and it's fundamental to the economy. So education should be protected as far as possible, and that should be not just up to 16, but up to 18, because, of course, we now expect people to learn till 18.
And if Liam Byrne was here yesterday, he said basically start from the beginning. Nothing would be ring-fenced. You'd recalibrate the funding right from the start. If you're working with Liam Byrne, let's say, this time next year, would you say that's good? Better without any of the ring fences?
Well, I've always argued in the past that even precious areas like the health service, we just have, if you ring fence 70% of government, then the other 30% has to take all the hits, and that's not reasonable. But I made my point earlier about 16 to 18 on the assumption that we retain roughly the current pattern. And if we do maintain a ring-fence system, then 16 to 18-year-olds have got to be inside, not outside. But in an ideal world, I would open up public spending to critical scrutiny across the board.
I'm going to raise something here which has come through to us as a question from Sheila Leagrave, and I know is felt very strongly by a lot of people in the room, and that's about careers advice. Yeah. It's woeful. It's woeful for kids at school. It creates a massive gap between what they think they want to do, what the employers need them to do, what the schools and the colleges want to teach them. Why is something that's so sort of obvious, so fundamental, and probably not that expensive to fix, so lacking?
Well, you're right, it is woeful, it is a mess. When we came into the government, we had a system called Connections, and the evaluations that were done of it were exceedingly unflattering, so we got rid of it. But for quite a long time, there wasn't an effective replacement. But I think it's fair to say that in the last year, partly because of badgering from business, this issue has now risen to high up the agenda. There is now a much clearer set of guidance for schools on careers education. Ofsted now have clear instructions to test schools' performance in careers provision. There are some quite innovative ideas going around about how to do careers education. There's a school in Burnley that I went to recently where there is a local social enterprise which has set up its own version of the Department of Work and Pensions at the entrance to the school. And kids come in every day, and posted up on the wall are the jobs that are on offer at the local DWP offices. And kids who are interested are encouraged then to go down to the firm. They may be only 12 years old, but actually see what it is, what the world of work is like. But there aren't too many of those schemes, unfortunately.
Another question, this one from Gareth James Rees, who says, I run a training company. The SFA keep removing fundable qualifications all the time. I can't run my business properly as I don't know from month to month what's fundable. Why can't we have a window? Makes it sound like sort of, the way the transfer window works for football. We all know they'll make changes during the summer, and that'll give us stability. It's a real problem, isn't it, if you just don't know when the money's going to disappear from one bit to another?
Yes, I would like trainers and indeed colleges to have more certainty and longer-term planning horizons. I think the one way of functioning successfully is to have a combination of flexibility and long-term provision. This clashes with the pressures on public finance, which are to keep all the public sector or publicly funding institutions on a tight leash. But I agree with the premise. Don't automatically accept that everything that private training providers say must be right. I mean, they have a very strong vested interest. We are trying to ensure that as far as possible, decision-making shifts to companies which want to do skill training and channel the funding through them as far as we can. And also to make sure that the individuals have choice, which is one of the reasons we've gone into loans for higher skill training.
I mean, this is something you keep coming back to, and you started your speech with the words, it's not going to be easy. Matt Atkinson asks, given the need for further cuts in public expenditure, how safe are FE colleges? Do you think we will see the overall number reduce?
Well, I've seen individual cases of amalgamations. there is a danger, I think, of just seeing amalgamations as the salvation of colleges that have difficulty. There are quite a few people in the room, I guess, who are presiding over colleges with 50,000 students, and some of these are superb. I know the Birmingham Met a little. It's an absolutely brilliant college, but size has disadvantages and remoteness and all those things. So amalgamating colleges into bigger and bigger units certainly isn't a panacea. But the problem is, if a college does get into very serious financial difficulty and it can't be turned around, what do you do? There's an obligation to the students, and the obvious way is to bring them within the structure of a neighbouring college, providing it's voluntary and you're not dragging down the healthy college. So I fear you may get a reduction in numbers because the logic of consolidation is that.
Let's talk a bit about the wider context, big politics. Tuition fees was a real moment for the Lib Dems in the last Parliament. Are you able to make any kind of policy pledges on education going into the next one?
Well, the problem with tuition fees was the pledge, it wasn't the policy, and the policy has turned out very well, and I hope people in this room understand that if we hadn't done it, the money would have come out of the FE sector, because those two things are the two biggest parts of my budget.
So you're pleased, just to get that clear, you're pleased that you did back tuition fees?
Yes, it had to be done.
And do you regret ever offering
the pledge?
No,
I do regret that we offered the pledge. It was a terrible mistake politically, but the policy has turned out very well, actually, in a variety of ways, despite we were warned there would be a big deterrent to people doing higher education. The opposite has happened. We've got growing numbers. We've got exceptionally large numbers of people with disadvantaged backgrounds going into higher education. We've got exceptionally large growing numbers of people from BME backgrounds going into it. They have not been deterred. And the reason they haven't been deterred is that they understand that actually we don't have a fee system. It's not like America. You don't pay fees to go to university. The system we have is a graduate tax system. The problem, we've got all the language wrong. What we have is a de facto graduate tax where people, once they've graduated, pay according to their income. And if you've got a low income, you don't pay.
Well, if Ed Miliband has up his sleeve, as many believe he does, a policy to cut, if you like, we'll call it the graduate tax, back to 6,000, would you tell him that was wrong?
I would, and I have. And I think he does understand the argument. And I think Ed Balls and Chuka Umunna, they understand. It would be a very, very retrograde move.
So if
I just finish, the effect of it would be to take $2 billion out of higher education.
So if you find yourself, let's say, in government with Labour next year, you will then be the party that is advocating higher tuition fees for students, higher graduate tax.
No, we're not advocating higher.
Higher than the party that you're in government
I don't
with.
think the Labour will, actually. It's interesting that having made a song and dance about this a couple of years ago, Ed Miliband hasn't returned to the issue. And I think it's because he's been persuaded by his colleagues that it would be very, very unwise and damaging. But obviously I can't speak for him, I'm not his party. But I think, the sensible people at the top of the Labour Party realise there are far more important ways of redirecting resources. But it would, I don't want to get into speculation about who's in the next government, but that is certainly a difference.
We're out of time, Vince, but let me just end. I started yesterday by saying politics at the moment is unprecedentedly complicated. You're right at the heart of it. What would be your estimate for where the Lib Dems will be in May? How many seats do you think you'll end up with?
Well, I think we'll actually do far better than the polls suggest because our support is highly concentrated. Paradoxically, when we've done very well in terms of the national poll, and at the last election we got, 22, 23%, we got less than 10% of the parliamentary seats. But in other elections, like the one I first got elected in, which was 1997, Paddy Ashdown was the leader. All the effort was concentrated into 45 seats, and we won them all. We didn't do well anywhere else. And, we've learnt to operate within the British political system, which is highly skewed against insurgent parties, the smaller parties. And the first past the post system is quite a cruel system. And there's no value just piling up support in public opinion polls. It doesn't get you any seats in Parliament, as UKIP will discover. What's helped, what we do now, because we're operating within the system that we have, is to make sure that our MPs are re-elected, and the vast majority of them will be.
Vince Cable, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
Thank you.